Welcome. As you know, this is an informal gathering. Our session is being recorded and it will only be broadcast later. But if you do not wish to be recorded, please do switch off your camera or microphone. This is yet another talk as part of the series on the living memory of cities, which we've been organizing with London Met. Alongside these sessions once a month, there's also an advanced studies group on sacred space entitled Presence, Person, Beauty. That's something we've been organizing with Father Peter Newby from St. Mary's University. And our next session will be on the 25th January. That will be a session with Father Michael Lang from the London Oratory. Father Michael will be talking about transcending beauty, a search for criteria of sacred architecture. So next Tuesday, and all are welcome, of course. Today we have with us Professor Christian Frost from London Met, who will be speaking on festival and the architecture of transition. We are very thankful to Christian since we've had to update the program and he's agreed to step in at such short notice. So thank you, Christian. The proceedings will be very simple. Eric will be chairing the session. Christian will do his keynote presentation, 30 minutes or so, perhaps, and this will be followed by the usual period for questions. So perhaps from London Met, Nick Temple or Matthew Barac might like to start us off, but that's only a suggestion. Meanwhile, I note to thank Joanne Gold and Nikolina Georgieva, who have been assisting with these sessions at Eric Parry Architects, and our graphics team, in particular Russell Watson and Roma McCook. They've been updating our website and events program, and that's all. And I give the floor to Matthew, if you will. Over to you, Matthew. Or not, in which case over to you, Eric.
Yeah, well, just to echo your words, José, that we're delighted to welcome Christian. Hi, Professor. And just to say that, you know, your close scrutiny of the city and its rituals and deep understanding of the use of civic space is something we all appreciate, and particularly, you know, when it comes to the places that you have spent so much time thinking and working in. So we really, knowing that we have many parallel journeys from common roots, just to say we're looking forward to this hugely and picking up, I'm sure, many questions at the end. So over to you, Christian.
Thank you. So I've got a sort of obviously a late call up for this, and so I just do a little bit of a background. So the work that Eric's referring to is the work I did initially on Salisbury, medieval Salisbury, in terms of processions, and which I updated with my PhD, which I did with Peter at London Met on civic festivals in Florence. And in that process of understanding that, I came across or developed some understanding which I'm going to test on you lot today. So it's very much a working idea, and it relates to the idea that maybe if the way we look at festivals, or the way one looks at festivals as a theoretical idea, or theoretically, could be useful if one uses a similar framework to look at architecture. And I've called that one of the things, with homage to Victor Turner, the architecture of transition. Now, it may take a little bit of a while for me to get there because I'm having to go through some justification for the associations. But if you bear with me, by the time we come to the end, I'm going to give 3 examples of how this might work with architecture. And I'd be very interested to see whether you think I've convinced you that it's a good idea or not. So in a sense, it's about festival as a way of looking, understanding festival as a way of looking. So let me just share my screen. So is that a full screen for everyone? Yeah, that's right. Okay. This paper discusses the opportunities that follow the use of tools designed to understand aspects of festive experience within the civic realm in relation to the way that architecture is described and evaluated. Starting from an extended but beautiful description of a festival in Alexandria written by Lawrence Durrell, the various elements of experience that, alongside the architecture of different ages, combine to make a mature festive setting will be discussed. Such an evocation of civic life in the context of this lecture series entitled The Living Memory of Cities grants an opportunity to open a discourse about the nature of the festive experience itself and how such experiences are described and analysed within the architectural humanities today, and from there move towards a proposition for a future understanding that links the experiences of such events to the way we understand and describe architecture itself. So this is a description by Lawrence Durrell. It's an extended description, so please bear with me, but I think it's important to set the scene because everyone thinks about festival in different ways. This is the festival of Santa Maria in Alexandria in the 30s, as recounted by Dali in Balthazar, the second novel of the Alexandria Quartet. With the dusk, that vast and threadbare expanse of empty ground always turned first gold and then brown, to brown cracked cardboard, and then lastly to violet as the lights began to prick the oncoming darkness as the backcloth of a European city itself began to light up window by window, street by street, until the whole looked like a cobweb in which the frost was set a million glittering brilliance. Camels somewhere snorted and gnawed, and the music and odour of human beings came across the night towards him, rich with the memories of the fairs he had visited with his parents as a child. In this red tar brush and work-stained clothes, he knew he would not be singled out by the crowd as one different from themselves. It was characteristic, too, that, though the festival of Santa Maria celebrated a Christian Coptic saint, it was attended and enjoyed by all, not least the Muslim inhabitants of the town, for Alexandria is after all still Egypt. All the colours run together. The whole encampment of booths, theatres, brothels and shops, a complete township, had sprung up in the darkness, fitfully lit by oil and paraffin stoves, by pressure lamps and braziers, by candlelight and strings of dazzling coloured electric bulbs. He walked lightly into the press of human beings, his nostrils drinking in the scent of aromatic foods and sweetmeats, of stale jasmine and sweat, and his ears the hum of voices that provided a background for those common sounds which always followed the great processions through the town, lingering on the way at every church for a recital of sacred text and coming gradually to the site of the festival. To him all this scattered novelty, the riches of bear dancers and acrobats, the fire swallowers blowing 6-foot plumes of flame from upcast mouths, the dancers in rags and party-coloured caps, indeed everything that the stranger would have been a delight, was to him only because it was so utterly commonplace. So much a belonging of part of his own life, like the small child he once had been. Like the small child he had once been, he walked in the brilliance of the light, stopping here and there with smiling eyes to stare at some familiar feature of the fair. A conjurer, dressed in tinsel, drew from his sleeves endless many-coloured handkerchiefs, and from his mouth 20 small live chicks crying all the time in the voice of a seabird. Manuli the monkey in a paper hat brilliantly rode around his stall on the back of a goat. Towering on either side of the thoroughfare rose the great booths of their sugar figures brilliant with tinsel, depicting the loves and adventures of the creatures inhabiting the folklore of the Delta. Heroes like Abu Zaid and Antar, lovers like Yuna and Aziz. He walked slowly with an unpremeditated carelessness, stopping for a while to hear the storytellers, or to buy a lucky talisman from the famous blind preacher Hussein, who stood like an oak tree, magnificent in the elf light, reciting the 99 holy names. From the outer perimeter of the darkness came a crisp click of sportsmen at snake singlestick, dimly sounding against the hoarse rumble of the approaching procession with its sudden bursts of wild music, kettle drums and timbrels, like volleys of musketry, and the long belly-thrilling rolls of camel drums which drowned and refreshed the quavering deep-throated flute music. "They are coming, they are coming!" A confused shouting rose, and the children darted here and there like mouse among the stalls. From the throat of the narrow alley spilled like a widening circle of fire upon the darkness, burst a long tilted gallery of human beings headed by the leaping acrobats and dwarfs of Alexandria and followed by at a dancing measure by the long grotesque cavalcades of gonfalons, rising and falling in a tide of mystical light, treading the peristaltic measures of wild music, nibbled out everywhere by the tattling flutes and the pang of drums, or the long shivering orgasm of tambourines struck by the dervishes in their habits as they moved towards the site of the festival. Allah, Allah, burst from every throat. Naraz took a stick of sugarcane from a stall and nibbled at it as he watched the wave moving forward to engulf him. Here came the Rifia dervishes, who could in their trances walk upon embers or drink molten glass or eat live scorpions or dance the turning measure of the universe out until reality ran down like an overwound spring and they fell gasping to earth, dazed like birds. The banners and torches, the great open-work braziers full of burning wood, the great paper lanterns inscribed with texts, they made staggering loops and patterns of light among the darkness of the Alexandrian night, rising and falling. And now the pitches were swollen with spectators, worrying at the procession like mastiffs, screaming and pulling. And still the flood poured in on its own wild music, perhaps the very music that the dying Antony in Kavafy's poem heard, until it engulfed the darkness, the great Maidan, spreading around it the fitful contours of robes and faces of objects without context, but whose colours sprang up and darkened the edges of the sky with colour. Human beings were setting fire to each other. Somewhere in that in the back of the hinterland, a smashed and tumbled masonry of abandoned and disemboweled houses, was a small garden with a 2-minute marking the site which was the sum and meaning of this riot. And here, before a glimmering taper, would be read a Christian prayer for a Christian saint, while all around rode the dark press and flood of Alexandria. A dozen faiths and religions shared a celebration which time had sanctified, which had made common to all and dedicated to a season and a landscape, completely obliterating its canon reference in law and code. To a religious country, all religions were one, and while the faithful uttered the prayers for a chosen saint, the populace enjoyed their fare, which had grown up around the celebration, a rocking carnival of light and music. So this passage was written by Durrell in 58, 2 years after the failure of the tripartite British, French and Israeli attack on Egypt that followed President Nasser's nationalisation of the Suez Canal. The failure of the Allied action allowed Nasser to order the seizure of most foreign assets within the country, and the subsequent laws mandating the Egyptianisation of foreign-owned banks, firms and insurance companies led to the departure of thousands of foreign residents from Alexandria, many of whose families had lived there for generations. This exodus led to the loss of the shared culture evident in the Feast of Santa Mariam that has been part of the civic life of the city for centuries. I make no political point in relating the loss of this particular festival. I could have picked one from most countries in many ages, descriptions of which would have offered the same multivalency of experience while being almost silent on the architectural qualities of the setting. The point here is to recognise that in investigating the questions that surround the loss of such manifestations of civic identity, we may perhaps better understand what such an event is and how it relates to the different ways we see and experience architecture, and consequently assist us in our ambition to create architecture fit for the communities of the future. Initial observations relating to the role of architecture in such a description reveal two specific obstacles. Firstly, there is almost no reference to the presence, form and materiality of architecture in the text. And secondly, even if there were, amidst current architectural debates, finding any consensus as to its role in the event would be very difficult. The first point is relatively easy to address because although architecture is not mentioned directly in Durrell's description of the feast, it clearly has a presence in the narrative. Architecture, like the clothes of the characters, is not fully described, but in picturing the scene, it is clear that people were not wearing Wellington boots, and the streets, squares and rooms and shrines of the place are not like Oxford Street, even at Christmas. There is an implicit quality of well-used ochres and scorched stone evoked that forms the backdrop for the bright candy-coloured accoutrements of the festival. Architecture is present and can be discussed even amidst this relative muteness. Consequently, architecture's presence and contribution to the event needs to be conceded, even if it appears relatively silent in this description. However, finding some sort of consensus, both in a historical or present context amidst the analysis of such an event, is much more thornier issue. In a landscape of contemporary architectural theories, many of which are focused on increasingly dispersed identities, or upon form alone, or upon architecture as some sort of language with a syntactic structure, there appears to be little hope of developing any real common cultural ground from which to build an understanding of its possible role in the festival. Where ambitions to describe the evident sense of community do exist among these various approaches, singular, social, cultural and formal and spatial dispositives built off difference are first analysed before being repacked into some sort of whole. A process apparently at odds with Durrell's account, where the differences appear to be subsumed in the order offered by the festival itself, rather than in the individuals that are participating in varying guises at the event. So this evening I'll attempt to address this problem by looking at the experiences inherent to such gatherings, focusing in the end more upon commonality, trying to maintain the qualities of Durrell description throughout the process, and having described this shared horizon, ask the question whether a similar investigation into the nature of architecture offers a different opportunity to evaluate architecture itself. Whilst this will mean I talk a lot about the experience of festival, I would ask you to consider simultaneously the same thoughts in relation to architecture, and I'll end the talk with some possible examples. So the first thing to say about Durrell's account is that it's an account of a ritual, a pilgrimage and a celebration of a Christian saint by a multi-faith community that is oriented towards the representation, both as an act of mediation towards the divine and towards the order of the city within which it occurred. Such a condition that oscillates between a divine moment, an annual event and a particular day can only occur because festivals create their own temporality separate from the everyday. The event is not a singular event, nor purely a remembrance, but a fusion of both, offering a complex temporality which is accessible to both. As Dagmar says, the time experience of the festival is rather its celebration, a present time sui generis. And following on from this realization comes the awareness that such oscillations of temporality and the horizons of experience which accompany it must really be accompanied by an equally significant variations in the nature of the meaning of the places that accompany them. Festivals therefore are in their nature the same time both one and many in terms of both time and place. And this explicit multivalency offers any participant various opportunities to reflect on the aspects of being and architecture that are often concealed by the mundanity of their normal everyday activities, i.e. the spaces that appear for the most part relatively neutral can appear amidst the charged atmosphere of the festival, can reveal themselves to be highly significant places of mediation. Through participation in the festive action in the world, the protagonist becomes aware of the setting within a different horizon of meaning that exists alongside their normal experiences. In such an experience, the events and the setting combine to make the past present in a way that extends beyond the everyday theatrical pageant and more towards the conditions for ritual. And this extension can only occur because the action is critically linked to the setting. It is perhaps ironic then that because this link between the action and the place within which the action occurs is so fundamental to the experience and the mediative possibilities of the phenomenon, that the place often appears relatively inconsequential to those present, at least in terms of rapportage, like in Durrell's. However, although this investigation is interested in what can be described as relating to the festival's singularity in relation to its ontological conditions, in the description of the feast of Santa Mariam, several different groups of participants appear who, it could be argued, and would be argued by many contemporaries, all experience the feast day differently depending on their status, their knowledge of the event, their identity, their faith, or their nationality, etc., etc. Therefore, the first question must be asked Is it possible to put aside these differences between the people in order that the unifying aspects of festival can be investigated? John Eade and Michael Selnow, in their book Contesting the Sacred, at the Anthropology of Christian Pilgrimage, suggest that this is not possible in relation to the praxis of pilgrimage, which it could be argued is a type of festival. They argue that their book amounts to a recognition that pilgrimage is above all an arena for competing religious and secular discourses, for both the official co-optation and the non-official recovery of religious meanings, for conflicts between orthodoxies, sects, and confessional groups, for drives towards consensus and communitas, and for counter-movements towards separateness and division. They've gone to argue that paradigmatic meanings built off particular theoretical or religious precepts belonging to different knowledge bases for the different participants, related to observable pragmatic events of pilgrimage, are dependent on the narrative brought to the particular situation by the worshipper or the pilgrim. Using Jerusalem and not Alexandria as a key example, they suggest that because pilgrimage sites in the city operate equally for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in all their various forms, any meaning associated with the location must be brought to the neutral site by the visitor. For the authors, a sacred centre appears as a vessel into which pilgrims devoutly pour their hopes, prayers, and aspirations. That's a quote from them. Rather than understanding the site as having a multifaceted identity that somehow belongs to it. They see the identity of place as a social construction made from a number of different sources which are applied to meaningless form. But if one begins in this way of looking for meaning in each individual present, then spectators, for example, would be almost completely excluded because they do not appear to have an opportunity to contribute to the event or the place. They're not necessarily pouring their meaning into it. What is apparent from such a process, starting from the individual, is that the attempt to describe some meta-identity of place comes from a belief that it is not possible to create a consensus among groups relating to particular settings if their knowledge, their status, or their beliefs differ. Equally, they argue, there cannot be a consensus if such a concept is built upon a purely empirical observation of social activity, where identity is created by the association of an action with a corresponding belief or value. They label such associative processes as functional theories of correspondence and query how such a method could work in places such as Jerusalem, where each religion establishes a different relationship to the city, apparently creating what more than one of what they call a pattern of correspondence. Therefore, whilst they argue that such singular structuralist approaches can never produce a theoretical fit over of places of such diversity, and tend in their error to reveal, perhaps inadvertently, more about the apparent differences between individual discourses than any potential overall congruence. Their key premise is that the only way to describe the whole is by acknowledging the large realm of competing discourses that incorporate and relativize some of these smaller, more structured paradigms. Such a hypothesis can only be sustained if it is imagined that the diverse experiences and actions evident in Durrell's description are brought to the place by each participant. And this is where we need to go back, and why I gave such a long introduction of Durrell's text, because I think thinking about bringing to that is important. They're brought to the place by each participant, or at least by each distinct identity group, rather than believing that the identity of the event might belong in part to the place itself, including aspects of its architecture. The process of bringing identities should be enough of an issue to at least question such approaches. But this theory is also has a difficulty that, notwithstanding any ontological aspects of the paradigm, the paradigmatic aspects of pilgrimage have their own social implications for the everyday life of the protagonist and the society they're a part of. For people like Eade and Selnow, the problem emerges in such approaches that pilgrimage is seen as either supporting or subverting the established social order, where the social order is seen as a state of being always connected to the politics of the everyday. Thus, a full description of any event for these guys within such an evaluation would have to combine the visible phenomenon, that's the pragmatic event, and its theoretical background, the meanings that combine to make up the paradigm, including its hegemonic basis, both supplied by the particular worshipper at a particular shrine within the conditions of reality binded by the knowledge of the individual concerned, as well as their sensory experience, because they pour their meaning into Alexandria like water into a vessel. Consequently, such evaluations often become self-fulfilling prophecies, satisfied with explanations of activities limited within the restricted parameters of theoretically constructed paradigms that conveniently ignore the broader meaning inherent to the ontological nature of the experience as a whole, which, as suggested at the beginning, shift towards ritual and thus establish tensions towards the divine. In the end, these arguments suggest that even though some aspects of the experience can be communicated and recombined into some sort of whole, they can never be totally reconcilable with some common telos. So there is within this approach to researching place in the context of differing identities within a field of action, an acknowledgement that analysis of difference often problematizes understanding community, resulting in the conclusion that identity can only ever be understood by difference. And although such approaches may aspire to find drives towards consensus and communitas, such approaches really tend more often than not towards counter movements of separateness and division. However, there is another way to consider such a difference. For example, in Foucault's description of the idea of the dispositive, he dissects or begins to dissect the experiences which, under different circumstances, could be described simply as different manifestations of the same culture, different horizons within a common order. The problem is not the idea of the whole, but the way in which the process of discovery and description approach the issue then. Therefore, the next part, I'll be looking or trying to look at the exercise of understanding ontology of the festival, grounded in the premise that culture is the origin of the communitas at the beginning, with the idea that rather than waiting to see if we can reconstruct it at the end, perhaps it's more useful to do it at the beginning, and is a more productive way to understand both festival and architecture. So the next section will look at a similar conditions described by Durrell's account of the festival in Alexandria in a way that recognises the dialectical relationship of the past and the present as a basis of continuity and community. Studies that operated within this territory do not lead to histories in the traditional sense. They do use history as well as other disciplines, but they do not understand the present historically. But they do so in order to understand the present historically. This is characterized by Geschichtlichkeit by Gadamer and Dilthey, translated as either historicity or historicality. In the context of this study, it means that by looking at historical settings for festivals in relation to the things that can be experienced today, issues of continuity emerge that reveal the deep structures of meaning and belonging that point to relationships that are being evaluated. And I ask you here to think back to Durrell's description, how much of that was historical and how much of it was contemporary. In such an evaluation, paintings, texts, buildings do not stand out outside festival events, which represent particular religious, political or social hierarchies, but that they themselves participate within the unfolding of the city's narrative. They cannot be seen as pieces of material culture locked in some distant past, because they are inseparable from culture as a whole. And this is why I think festival, in a sense, helps understand this. And Gadamer talks about this when he says, works of architecture do not stand motionless on the shores of the stream of history, but are borne along by it. Even if historically minded ages seek to reconstruct the architecture of an earlier age, they cannot try to turn back the wheel of history, but must mediate in a new and better way, past and present. So my very long introduction is a way of saying that festival and architecture both have that condition, and Gadamer talks about that very concisely there. This discourse can be traced back at least to Plato, who suggests in his Symposium that every kind of artistic creation is poetry. Aristotle also suggests similar sentiments in his Poetics when he defines the work of art as a mimesis of praxis, as a representation of people doing or experiencing something. The significance of this is that the idea of the creative act, like a festival, always exists within its capacity for reenactment. Seen in this way, the work of art is never an object, but something that continues to be recreated in some way through the experience of it. It is clear that festival, particularly in its continual reenactment, can be understood in this way, but it also can be said with other forms of artistic creation. Although the reenactment inherent to festival makes this relationship to its origins explicit, it is in fact inherent to most experience. Therefore, this way of understanding the way in which man engages with the world suggests that engagement which forms the basis of experience is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. But this definition of the poetic act of creation is not without difficulties. And over the centuries, there have been many instances where the tension present within the making or interpreting of particular situations has been reduced to in scope to enable more concise evaluations and conclusions, as in the cases we've just looked at. The primary issue is that we exist within the very experience we're trying to evaluate, linguistically, historically, and spatially. To this recognition that we can never totally move outside the conditions which we are attempting to describe must be added the continuity of form, participant, as well as the different aspects of temporality evident in the experience itself, as again, festival really makes this very obvious. Trying to disclose these more elusive aspects of festival, which though shared and defined are not facts or things described by facts, but nevertheless can be seen as present in some form of experience of the festival, are coupled with a need to recognize the relationship between the author of the festival who intended it and in some way the viewer who interprets or uses it. In Alexandria, it is also apt to argue that this point that all three religions cited within the festival have some parts related to a common tradition. Consequently, an inquiry into the relationship of their commonality, both culturally and historically, must form a part of a critical evaluation of their levels and means of engagement. Such an evaluation does not necessarily lead to a multivalency alluded to earlier in relation to the work of Eden Salnow, where all meaning is lost in a relativism of the idea of subjective individual interpretation, but can also point to a fusion of horizons where the creator and viewer first recognize their primary relationship to the world as a whole, to architecture maybe, with its specific shared cultural horizon. It is upon this ground that the relevance of the festival as poetic activity can be communicated, understood and shared, because fundamentally, as Paul Ricoeur argues, understanding is an intersubjective process. So this way of thinking about space is not new and was present in different forms in the Middle Ages and continued to be a significant part of culture, finding its final flowering in the 18th century, perhaps. Accepting then that the evaluation of the situation at hand can only ever be partial, that the primary relationship of the space is to be evaluated to the world as given, it is the first task of the inquirer, bearing in mind the will of the artificer, to try to evaluate the existing conditions of the spaces in question and try to reveal something of their latent qualities, qualities which form the deep background of the natural world but often lack explicit articulation. Such ground appears at moments in the Durrell text, building out, and we'll come back here now, so building out from the black hinterland of smashed and tumbled masonry, of abandoned and disemboweled houses, was a small garden with a tomb in it marking the site which was the sum and meaning of this riot. While not far away, Rifia dervishes, who could in their trances dance the turning measure of the universe out, until reality ran down like an overwound spring, until they fell gasping down to earth like dazed birds. And towering on either side of the thoroughfare rose the great booths with their sugar figurines, brilliant with tinsel depicting the loves and adventures of the creatures inhabiting the folklore of the Delta. Where amidst this activity one can hear the hum of voices which provided the background to those common sounds which always followed the great processions through the town, lingering on the way at every church for the festival of the sacred text, coming gradually to the site of the festival. So we can see in all of these different layers, these different ways of understanding and these different ways of engaging. So in such actions, historic themes, pragmatic and paradigmatic, present in these rituals can be reconnected with the contemporary city. Even where the population is primarily secular, aspects such as the theoretical content can retain resonance because many of the religious themes and interpretations can be translated into secular ones as well. For example, in the early 5th century AD, John Cassian articulated a way of understanding scripture originally conceived as a guide to monastic Bible study, using various levels, literal, allegorical, tropological, and anagogical. He then applied the same interpretation to Jerusalem. Jerusalem can be taken in 4 senses: historically, literally, as the city of the Jews; allegorically, as the Church of Christ, in the sense of the institution rather than the building; anagogically, as the heavenly city of God, which is the mother of us all; and trobologically, as the soul of man, which is frequently subject to praise and blame from the Lord, often under this title. That's John Cassian. Pilgrimage to this Jerusalem would clearly be very different from the pilgrimage described earlier by Eden Salnow in relation to the range of competing discourses and the relationship between pragmatic and paradigmatic meaning. If one considers this description carefully, pilgrimage for the medieval pilgrim already comprised multiple identities. For Eden and Salnow, only the literal aspect of this scheme could be characterized as pragmatic, and consequently the remaining 3 aspects of the city, according to Cassian, would be subsumed into the broader discourse of what they would consider paradigmatic, ultimately finding meaning or not in the theory that analyzes the event. This may not necessarily have been a problem, except that although it can be seen how tropologically tropology and allegory could form a successful part of the theoretical tract, the anagogical aspects would be more difficult to accommodate. Indeed, this more ontological aspect of the discourse would only be evident to the degree that it was seen to be impacting on the other 3. However, more recently, like Cassian, Paul Ricoeur suggests that there are at least 4 modes of discourse: the scientific, the poetic, the religious, and the speculative, that contribute to the ontological understanding of language. Cassian and Ricoeur's configurations can be associated relatively clearly, where literal meaning becomes scientific discourse, allegorical becomes religious discourse, tropological becomes poetic, and anagogical becomes speculative. As we have seen already, the literal scientific pragmatic interpretation does not reveal the full depth of the situation, but this simple matching of pairs also reveals that the tropological poetic interpretation cannot alone complete the analysis. In addition to the poetic, there is also, within both frames, an implied tension towards the divine that forms a critical part of both positions. Phenomenology does not, therefore, purely act in relation to poetic situations and sensual experience, but in relation to the nature of being itself. Nevertheless, the extension from a purely literal vision of the experience towards this common or shared tropological poetic mode of discourse potentially allows the artist-poet to begin to reveal the fullness of meaning embodied in all 4 modes, especially when open to what Ricoeur identifies as the religious or speculative. And I think we see some essence of that within Durrell's description. If we employ this understanding as an evaluation of the Feast of Alexandria, it was seen that the processions enacted at the time were mediated explicitly by the rituals of the church and extended to the rituals of the city. This structure, built into the city but not only revealed explicitly on feast days, was latent for the remainder of the year. That is not to say that it was not accessible at other times, only that the relationship was made explicit during the feasts. On a critical level, this suggestion has the shifted focus away from objects and onto places, more particularly their use, and on the different ways in which people engage in festive activity within the architecture in the city which it accommodates. As it is clear from the Durrell text, this experience within the built environment is so inherent to the experience that it is often not referred to at all. However, if you have ever seen footage of flash mobs, to see that there is you only have to look at a flash mob to see that there is a difference. Flash mobs that occur in or around civic buildings have a tension inherent to the actions. They seem to challenge something beyond propriety, whereas a flash mob in a shopping mall just looks like entertainment. To analyse this further, we have to look into the way that people engage differently in festivals, from spectators to participants. From the Durrell text, it is clear that people engage to different degrees, from consumers through witnesses to participants and worshippers, and ask whether the evaluation so far can bring this added hierarchy to the evaluation. And for this, we're going to shift to the work of Victor Turner. I'm going to go back to that one because it's more interesting. So the anthropologist, and we're coming on to this idea of transition now. The anthropologist Victor Turner suggests that the shared aspect of festival can be explained by a hierarchy of 3 layers of engagement that relate to 3 degrees of detachment from normal social situations, where he identifies separation, transition, and incorporation. Firstly, everyone who witnesses the event is separated into one community out of time. And at the other end are the smallest subgroup of the hierarchy, the festival participants who, in participating, deny their own identity and as a result are deemed to be incorporated. In between these 2 states rest the remainder of the population who experience transition, a sort of limbo, which has a few of the attributes of either the preceding or the subsequent profane social statuses or cultural states. Such a description for Turner was also applicable to the detachment experienced by a pilgrim, where in the act of pilgrimage, a new community he labelled communitas emerged. For Turner, this communitas was formed, revealed and shaped by the event itself, and was related to a state of being he called liminality, that emerged in a time out of time, similar to Gadamer's description of time sui generis mentioned earlier. So in this scenario, the variety of experience people encounter during the more ritualistic aspects of the festival are accounted for on an ontological level and tend to resist the identification of any individual with their normal social conditions. Such an analysis cannot be reconciled with the realm of competing discourses or the meta-discourse suggested by the theorists earlier, and consequently they argue that for Turner, this is a quote, so far from reflecting or reinforcing secular social structure, such an event is a liminal phenomenon which betokens the partial, if not complete, abrogation of that structure and tends towards communitas, a state of unmediated egalitarian association between individuals who are temporarily freed from the hierarchical social roles, secular roles or statuses, which they bear in everyday life. Consequently, their interpretation of Turner's theory, which starts from the idea of community, albeit structured by an internally experienced hierarchy, the ritual aspect is seen to become completely disassociated from the political or social conditions that may have contributed to the festival's conditions in the first place. And as a result, they dismiss Turner's theory as a discourse that relates to a particular discourse about ritual rather than a description of it. So this is a classic argument against beginning to move towards a sort of cultural horizon within the festival itself. But we must also be careful not to take the interpretation too far the other way. If Eden and Salno err on the side of a scientific explanation, trying to build towards an ontological understanding, someone like Mircea Eliade often drifted too far towards the speculative, where he confuses the extents and limits to the experience inherent to ritual and ontological order. So this is so in his work, The Sacred and the Profane, he suggests that, quote, every world is the work of the gods, for it was either created directly by the gods or was consecrated, hence cosmicized by men, ritually reactualizing the paradigmatic act of creation. This is as much to say that religious man can only live in a sacred world because it is only in such a world that he participates in being, that he has a real existence. The unknown space that extends beyond his world represents absolute non-being. The issue with this definition is that while it maintains the importance of the anagogical aspects of ritual, it problematizes the dialectic between the different modes of temporality described by above. described above. When he suggests that mundane experience is a form of non-being, the tension between the different modes of participation are permanently lost. In the end, the apparent conflict between Turner's understanding of festival and the realm of competing discourses advocated by Eden Salner serves only to confuse the situation. It is clear that there is an ontological component to the experience of the festival, because I think we can experience that and understand that in Durrell's description, but one that is rooted in the conditions of the mundane experience, not separated from it. So, while viewed purely psychologically, it could be argued that Turner's incorporation and the associated states of detachment suggests a separation from a world out of which the actual conditions for festival originally emerged. It would be a mistake to consider this detachment to be total or solipsistic. Both Turner's insistence on detachment and Eden Salner's response to perpetual engagement cloud any real ontological description of the situation. After all, it is the very specific location of the events, from pilgrimage through ritual to festival, that link the ontological conditions to the world from which any detachment occurs. Hence, it is the architecture of the city that does much to maintain the continuity of the tradition, the ultimate or foundational reference for the time out of time, even if the activities associated to it or the political conditions that drive it are subject to radical change. Consequently, in terms of the above ideas, it can be argued that it is a spatial argument to both components that is underdeveloped and leads to this apparently unresolvable dichotomy. Nevertheless, there is something in Turner's description that requires a little more evaluation. For Turner, the possible movement between the different modes of engagement, from separation through transition to incorporation, is the experience of the festival. And the mode of transition is Turner's way of trying to describe the value of the dialectical experience through a particular mode of being that is, in itself, irresolvable. And this is the key point I wish to offer in the discussion on architecture. Firstly, that in most good architecture, you can find separation, what we might call this utility, the fulfillment of the pragmatic aspects of the brief. At the other end of the spectrum, we can talk of incorporation. One might assess this as the ability of architects to design places of ritual. In this, we can see everything from the Parthenon through Hagia Sophia and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to Frederick Gibbard's Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. But of these, for example, which might also offer the experience of transition? Which of these buildings holds something of their ritual and festive life when in repose? Can we use this quiet encounter where we question and explore the architecture as a critical moment of judgment? Can we say that only great architecture has this character? That only great architecture embodies this dialectical experience of sacred city life with such clarity that while it does not force itself upon the quiet, resting will of civic life, it also does not fall completely into the background, but is more like a judicious elder waiting quietly until approached and then only communicates their wisdom. So this is where I'm going to look at then 3 examples to see whether you agree with anything or whether you think this very long description of transition has any value with the way one might look at architecture. So the first one I'm going to be talking about is the Laurentian Library. There's no real surprise that 2 of the most influential books about architecture written in the 20th century, Version Architecture and Complexity and Contradiction, both spend some time discussing Michelangelo. My suggestion here is that in this respect, that the respect with which they discuss Michelangelo's oeuvres is partially due to his ability to articulate this idea of transition as well as separation and incorporation. Let us take the Laurentian Library, begun in 1524, which sits next to the cloister of San Lorenzo in Florence, as an example. Sorry, could someone? Thank you. As an example. Sits the cloister of San Lorenzo in Florence as an example of what I'm suggesting. It sits on the western range of Manetti's cloister, which is itself located to the southern aisle of Brunelleschi's Church of San Lorenzo. The library was commissioned by Pope Clement VII, Giulio de' Medici, to house the manuscript collected by Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent. This runs along the western range of the vestibule and is designed to and the vestibule is designed to manage the reorientation from the cloister, a manifestation of God in nature, to the library, a manifestation of the amassed wisdom of man at the time. The transition between these two measures of wisdom and participation is managed by the architecture of the vestibule, constructed by Vasari and Aminati to Michelangelo's drawings. The restrained top light descending from the tall staircase, taller than the height of the library it leads to, creates a cool and dim spectacle that contrasts the light spaces it mediates, while still managing to articulate a strong chiaroscuro revealed by the overscaled details of the space, continually questioning the meaning and order of the space. Is it the room too small for the staircase? What are the brackets for? Are the frames meant for paintings or sculptures or windows? For me, these questions are the point. It is truly a great piece of architecture because it first of all presents these questions as aspects of the architecture, revealing something of the difficulty inherent to the Cinquecento relating to knowledge, reason and wisdom, perhaps presented here as forms of expectations in between the cloister, a vision of created nature, perfected as Eden, and the library, where one can view the evidence of man's attempts at understanding nature within the gift of nature. The vestibule offers, even in repose, this opportunity for reflection. Through variations in scale and light and motif, Michelangelo reveals the transition that is the heart of the experience in the Cinquecento, of visiting such a famous collection, somewhere between wisdom and folly, exactly like the range of experience available in a festival setting, somewhere between separation and incorporation, in transition. The second example is a slightly different in that the orientation change is vertical. In this case, the architecture is designed to reveal the transition through the breaking of the illusion of immersion. The interior of the Church of St. George at Weltenburg was designed by the Assam brothers, Cosmas Damian and Egid Quirin, from 1721 to 31, within a relatively new church that had already included much of the structure, including the large marble columns that skirt the perimeter. Nevertheless, while adding the stucco and frescoes, they did alter some aspects of the building, moving the east wall out, letting the roof truss break out to the width of the choir, lengthening the choir in the altar area by adding a protruding apse, raising it a little to add hollow light vault. Throughout this part of Germany at this time, there are many examples of relatively small communities, both secular and religious, building immense churches in the late Baroque style. To modernise, it often appears excessive and, in a world governed by much reason of modernity, kitsch and superficial. However, in this period, in this part of Europe, this architecture is above all theatrical. As Carsten Harris argues, these buildings were a part of a cultural understanding of the church as theatrum sacrum, where the large frescoes of the Bavarian Rococo churches tended to raise a second earth, with its own heaven and its own horizon above the earth to which we belong. The representation inherent to architecture of such a space formed a critical setting for ritual as mimetic practice. This was a church and as such heralded some aspects of heavenly Jerusalem. It was real, but at the same time, not the actual holy place. The rituals transformed the utility of separation into mystery of separation, but they were at the same time linked to the horizon of mundane culture. Even the elevated horizon offered through the metaphor of light and shadow and through the transformation of architecture through sculpture and stucco to paint did not detract from the presentness of the spaces. Such thoughts are often difficult to fathom when faced by the richness of these interiors, but here in Weltenburg we get a moment when the Assam brothers reveal this transitional moment in the most direct way. Caught in the mystery of the folding walls and silhouettes of St. George, we see the oval crown of the Redeemer held up by 9 putti and a garish representation of the architect himself. It does nothing to diminish the iconography of the interior, its dual horizon, or its sacred intent, but it could not be done today. Can you imagine if Richard Rogers or Alvaro Caesar placed an image of themselves in the same position of a church they had designed? Instead of an argument being one of understanding of mimetic incorporation, it would be considered at best egotistical and at worst sacrilege. Not because we do not understand ritual, but because we do not understand transition. In the same way that researchers of festival are continually asked who owns the festival, hence who is excluded, before one can begin to understand or explain its communitas, apparently we find it almost impossible to understand the significance of architecture to ritual because we either want to ground it in the mundane political order, stripping it of its ontological significance, or we want to cut its link to the earth and let explanations drift into ethereal harmony and order which bears no relationship to the everyday world within which we strive. Cosmas Adam was perhaps laughing at us for this folly, not because his image was later deployed upon the local ale. The last one I'm going to be looking at is Pavilion Swiss. This is a little bit more ambiguous, and I'll be interested to hear what people's opinions are. So my final example is the Pavilion Swiss. While it would be could have been easier to pick a later building such as Ronchamp or La Tourette or Chandigarh to describe a similar issue, looking at an earlier piece such as the Pavilion Swiss has the effect of dispelling the myth of the phases of Corb's career being concerned necessarily with different issues. What the Pavilion illustrates is a concern for the transition, equally evocative as any later works, but executed in a very simple manner, I think. The building is built mediated between a university accommodation area and some fields behind. It's not particularly relevant for Corb as he is interested in the orientation from community to individual, which shifts from shared ground floor spaces to the individual student rooms above. The building can be approached from many directions, and in order to gather everyone towards the entrance, he uses the whole undercroft as a porte cochere and then places a layer of vitreous tiles which run from the outside through the entrance and into the main interior public areas of the ground floor. On entry, you are faced with a slightly raised walkway that emerges from behind the sculpted piece of wall plastered with oversized photographic images that shields the beginning of the stair and its continuation to the floor above. Both the floor and the ceiling materials continue through the common room beyond, symbolized in the original photographs by a marble table in front of another curved wall that arches away towards the field and the gardens beyond. This whole space was designed to mediate between the outside world of nature and the refined isolation of the student cells above. There is no guide from the landscape of the place which would suggest the change from a linear to a curved and shifted geometry. And eventually, the journey both ends in a similar linear plan to it begins in the undercroft. The sophistication of the work works on the basis that the movement in such a building mediates between the idea of community and the individual. And at each point in the journey, the individual is allowed to see both their destination and their starting point, both individual and community. The generosity of the space is in its ability to allow the constant reflection and the transition from the individual to community. The building is designed to allow the protagonist walking through the spatial sequence of the foyer to reflect that their identity lies somewhere between isolation and sociability. But in order to understand this, you have to understand that for Le Corbusier, the marble table within the common room has, in this setting, the significance of incorporation. It is a place for the ritual meal, the place of communion, of community and dwelling. If you see it, the table, if you see just a table, then transition is difficult to find in the building. This photo from the Oeuvre Complète is one of those photos Corb uses, which leave one in little doubt of his intentions. Somewhere between the material majesty of the marble slab and the ephemeral scalelessness of the photographic images, the light coming in a deep shadow towards the cave-like space at the rear, placed against the rubble garden wall. Here, it is almost as if the whole building offers the moments of transition by revealing what it is to dwell. So, conclusion. I'm going to leave it on that photo. Is the experience of festival, is the experience the sum of the festival, all of the individual engagements, or something else? And what can architecture contribute to such a potentially atomized landscape? The moment we assume that architecture is more than a blank background to experience, we come down on the side of meaning and cultural memory. It is therefore strange that in such a landscape, so much discourse is shifting to understand identity rather than community, and, as I have argued here, the transition between the two. In all three examples discussed at the end of this talk, the architecture manages to perform its requirements for utility and separation, and for ritual and incorporation, but also, I believe, most significantly for transition. The ability for the buildings to represent the ontological significance of the processes they accommodate at the same time as being a successful setting for it is a rare commodity in architecture, but one that distinguishes these buildings as a form of architecture that requires engagement as places and settings rather than forms or objects. Thank you. I'm gonna stop there. I'm afraid it was a bit long at the beginning, but I had to get to a point where I could at least get you on the same page and thinking about transition. So hopefully there'll be some questions. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Christian. So let's. I don't think at all a problem of kind of length. Thank you. All necessary. Can we invite questions, please? Yes, please, Matthew. And then.
Yes, I see Ray has also got his hand up, so I'll go first because once Ray speaks, I'll be intimidated because this is obviously his field of total expertise. I was very interested. You spoke, Christian, about the kind of politics of aspects of these situations, and yet the passage, especially in the way that you presented it from Durrell. It really spoke of being very much kind of caught up in the occasion. The atmosphere was really very vivid, and we were kind of captured by that. And so I'm interested, especially with regard to the idea of the festival as also a place of protest, of asserting the kind of relationship between a festival and a demonstration, if you like, a protest, a place of asserting difference, and this question of agency. On the one hand, you have the model of being very much caught up in the situation, consumed by it, taken up by the occasion, but also also being out of it in some way, being able to see yourself as an actor, almost as a member of the audience. And you mentioned this term from Foucault, dispositif, and he talks very interestingly when he speaks about the dispositif and the idea of disposition as in terms of the arts of existence, that individuals have a level of agency which they can be creative about. That refers also to their capability to navigate in different ways situations which may be all-consuming. So when you did come to Turner, you spoke a little bit about this tension and this reciprocity between involvement and distance. But I was really wondering about this dimension of criticality that is present within the festival, and the possibility of a festival which may have this ritual dimension also be a setting for playing out resistances.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because this is one half of an argument that I'm working on at the moment. So hence it's sort of perhaps slightly rough edges to the argument I'm trying to make, and I haven't pulled out pieces that are. But the other half of the argument is resistance, and the festival has within itself the ability to resist co-option, to complete meanings. That within the festivals itself, not only does it have different levels of engagement from commerce through to play and conflict, very many agonistic aspects, political aspects are played out within the festival. Of course they are. I think the festival is an opportunity to do that. And what I presented is just one half of an argument, which is that there's this notion of transition, and on the other hand, there's this notion of resistance, that they both work together. Now, again, this is in early days for me, and part of the reason why I agreed to come in as a latecomer was to sort of throw it out there and see what responses I get to the argument, because it's not yet a fully formed thing. But what I would say in terms of your question is that I think what I was trying to do in that first section was to try to say that if you start from, you know, notions of difference, you don't get to community necessarily. If you start from community, you can foster difference within it, but you don't make community by bringing identities which are already dispersed. That for me is the problem with the way in which certain ways in which architecture is looked at. So for example, when I talk about the festivals of Florence, which is what I did most of my work on, and I talk about the historical continuity of it, one of the first questions I get asked by anthropologists or social historians is, who owns it? Who owns the festival? And I say to them, well, actually, that's not really important, because built within the festival is resistance, is the arguments that work against it as well as work for it. And that even if you're not a part of the direct ownership of the festival, there are still opportunities for you to engage that undermine certain aspects of it. That's a part of the festival itself. It's not clear. And these sorts of things just, it may be too big of a leap to move to architecture as an idea, but it seemed to me to be an interesting proposition to see whether you could apply the same sort of notions when a lot of conferences I go to, we see people looking at increased levels of atomization of very small notions of dispositives, almost fragmented into smaller areas, and then using that as a vehicle through the analysis to actually say, well, what happens if we, you know, accept that that might be a part of the reality or the way in which it might be analysed. But even if that were the case, and there's only 5% or 2% is a part of the community, what happens if we start from that point of view rather than the other point? So it's not that I'm trying to take difference out. I'm not saying that everyone is engaging with the same idea or belief, but that the framework, like potentially the framework for architecture, offers the opportunity for different forms of engagement, but that's not neutral. It's not completely neutral. It's built within the history and the memory, if you like, of the experience of festival or in architecture, in the way in which architecture is built in that. So I maybe didn't quite make that work, but I don't know if that answers your question. But that was,
yeah, it does, and I think that what you were pointing to in the analysis did start to get us there. As you said, it could be a longer piece presentation, but I think that kind of theatrical dimension where it's and both. I'm also just I was thinking about, for instance, the kind of the kind of lessons of Bertolt Brecht and Owen Piscator, the idea that you're in it and you're outside of it at the same time, and the resin, and I think that can transfer very nicely to the idea of the architectural setting. I remember Peter Carl, who I think is here, talks about the resistance of places in terms of that insistence that they assert their own reality at that time when, you know, the situation might want to take you out of that reality. And I think that dimension of resistance that we get from places and placemaking is a good. It's useful in your analytic in the transfer from festival to architecture. So yeah. Anyway, I'll give way to Ray.
Thank you. Yes, please, Ray, please.
Thank you. Delighted to join you today. I'm from Manchester School of Architecture, for those who don't know me, and so many overlaps with the work that I'm currently struggling to find the time to write up, is fair to say. And the examples that I draw on are contemporary Japanese festivals. But just to pick up Matthew's point, there's a long history in Kyoto, in particular, of Matsuri, the Japanese festivals, being used as a direct form of protest against the ruling classes, that they would have almost a shock festival that just descends on a particular bridge next to the castle in order to effect some change that was desired. But I think so many points that I wanted to pick up, and I suppose I don't want to dominate the discussion, but I think the one that I wanted to come in on in particular was Victor Turner and the discussion of anthropology within all of this. And I suppose for me, the discussion of Turner, always tends towards the discussion of threshold rather than transition. And I kind of wanted to delve a bit deeper into what you saw as the distinction between those two terms, and also maybe to discuss slightly more contemporary anthropology, like the work of Tim Ingold that my work draws on, where the notion of the dwelling perspective in his not so recent 2000 work really asks us to think about maintenance as an aspect of dwelling within a place. And one of the ways that I've been looking at the festivals is that they maintain relations within urban and rural environments, and that the repetition is part of that maintenance process, that it's about stitching different elements of the community together, and sometimes in problematic ways reinforcing existing power structures as well as overturning them. But I suppose my primary thought was around that distinction between transition and threshold.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was looking very particularly at the work in Florence, and for example, there's very little. It's amazing how Michelozzi's courtyard in the Palazzo Vecchio, the thresholds still work in the contemporary festival, where the building suddenly, Palazzo Vecchio suddenly opens and becomes the hall upstairs, which is usually closed to the public, where the dignitaries gather as a part of one of the morning processions, which goes between the cathedral and the town hall, as a direct representation of this link between civic and church ordering. That there's no police separating anyone. There's no, like there would be here, there's no high-vis jackets and fences that separates, and that people stand and they still engage within a civic way. That's really amazing. And I found myself crossing these boundaries like a sort of normal and nosy architect does, and taking photographs, but finding that people weren't crowding up and trying to, that the thresholds themselves within the buildings still work within a really clear way on the feast days. And therefore you could look at the question for me, in that was how that threshold, which is, I think, whether that's a spatial threshold or a physical or a mental, a temporal threshold, there are different questions in a sense. And for the space, in terms of the spatial threshold, I think that's what I was in trying to link it directly to pieces of architecture, was trying to think about those thresholds in a very physical way. But of course, it works within a temporal framework as well, because these places are both one and many. They are reused over a period of years, as you say, maintained over a period of years, and adapted and changed. It's not like they stay the same as well. But I think that's the sort of notion of tradition with a small t. So I don't see a distinction necessarily in this piece. I would say it's quite early in terms of its development as a piece of writing, but just threshold and transition probably interchangeable. The only reason I didn't use it was because threshold, I think, is more, people have more preconceptions about what threshold is in architecture, whereas transition allowed me to pull people in a direction which was a little more unfamiliar and ask them to define it in a slightly different way. But I take your point. I mean, Ingold's work on dwelling and maintenance, all of these things would form a part of it. It's just that for me, Turner was such a simple and clear description that for the sake of what I'm trying to do today, it seemed to be a simple way of opening that discussion up. But yeah, I mean, it's a conversation which I think we could continue for a long time over.
Yeah, well, I think your reason for not using threshold is precisely the reason I like to use it, because there's a matching up of those two terms. And their usages in those two disciplines. I think it makes for some really interesting ways of thinking. But thanks.
Thank you for that dialogue. And Nicholas Temple is there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture, and I think it's fascinating, and it's certainly made me think. The one thing that seemed, very evident, I think, to everyone just listening to the detailed description of Durrell's account in Alexandria was the kind of the visceral nature of the experience, the sensual nature of the experience. I was almost smelling the festival. I was almost smelling the spaces, but just by the description. But going back to Matthew Barrack's point, in a way, there's something about this idea, of course, ritual that deals with this very fine line between order and chaos, levels of stability that one can be to some extent in control of the occasion, and those things that splinter off and actually end up becoming chaotic or rebellious. And the word riot, of course, comes into the description. When you kind of look at that in the context of the three buildings that you describe and how they demonstrate this notion of transition, the three buildings, of course, represent three very different periods and different kind of cultural outlooks. And the one thing that struck me, looking at obviously Michelangelo's Laurentian Library, looking at the great Baroque interior, and of course this great Swiss pavilion, is that there is a sense in which the architecture is being undone at a point. Even the way Le Corbusier represents graphically the Swiss pavilion and the role of the curve in that building and that mural, it seems as if the purity of the architecture, almost like the Laurentian Library and the architectural elements that are presented, there's almost a sense in which the building is undoing itself. And this idea of transition that you describe seems to be implicit in the nature of this. It becomes important in order to be drawn into the architecture. And that idea of transition, actually, in terms of the treatment of the architecture as a movement, as a dynamic, it seems to me to be very evident. I think the three examples you did, convey that very, very clearly, but in very different kinds of cultural contexts. So I'm just kind of raising that as an observation.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, what I tried to pick three buildings that most people might have gone to, or at least gone to something similar, because I think what's important is that one's experienced the buildings, because so much of the culture that we live in is about not directly experiencing, and in a sense, the point of the Durrell at the beginning is because if I use the term festival, like many people, it's like, to a certain extent, it's coming back to Ray's point. It's like threshold. It can mean anything from an aluminium strip to an extraordinary portal, or things between two temporalities. And the notion of that language, or the way in which those things present themselves, is something that I think you have to have been to a certain extent to understand where that richness lies. And I think your observation of it being undone is a really interesting one, because of course within each festival, and why that description at the beginning is so important to what I was trying to argue then, albeit then go through that middle section, which was about how not to look at it really, rather than how to look at it. Every festival has within itself the anti-festival. Every festival has within itself the ability to undo itself, and that aspect of, you know, where do I sit? Am I on the outside of it? And so it's a bit like this notion of the difference between a spectator and a witness. If you're a spectator to something, you sit outside it, but potentially as a witness, you are also an observer, but there's an implication that you have some engagement with it, either ethically, socially, or whatever. And I think those sorts of terms are the terms in which I'm interested in trying to understand whether if it's possible to use the work that I've done on trying to understand how one engages with festival, which, as I said at the beginning, is strangely silent. That's really the strange. If you read the accounts of Vigliani's accounts of festivals, the festivals in Florence, they're almost silent on the architecture of the city itself, but they're clearly absolutely central to the whole experience of the order of the city and what the city is representing to itself. That's the point. That the festival is about it, you know, in a sense, it's about the self-representation of something. And so the undoing of something is, in a sense, the moment at which you realize the process of doing. There's this balance that's always present within it. So yeah, I'm sorry that it's not as clear an argument as it could be, but it seems to me that there may be something in there that might just force people to think in a slightly different way about architecture rather than in a conventional way. Because I think a lot of the way that we, as a group of academics, talk about things, there's a sort of tacit agreement in the way that we think that architecture is and its relationship to the living memory of cities. But that's not true of all architectural academics, and are not true of all architecture, and probably we're in a minority, one could argue, in a certain degree. And so I was just looking to see whether it was possible to use this idea of festival. And as I say, the other half of it is this resistance aspect, the fact that you can't co-opt a festival for your own devices. It has a resistance to that which is linked to the place, the spatial setting of the activity itself. And that spatial setting is the architecture of the city and of the building itself. And so the balance between these things, I think, you know, you could argue we're underplaying our aspect of engagement in a way. And I think, you know, so yes, I agree. Thanks for that observation. I think it's really, really useful for me.
Thank you. Yeah, David, you're there, please.
Just a quick, simple question. What you mentioned just now about silences and earlier the latencies, maybe also the untimeliness. Are those attributes of the Corbusier space that you described? Does latency play a role there? Are there aspects of that entry sequence that one would think of as silent? I'm very attracted to your account, yeah. And there are dimensions of festivity that I'd like to hear more about, and especially that we're there passing into the building en route to one's own apartment. It discloses itself as a prosaic space, but at the same time, it's potentially more than that. Can you say a little bit more about that potentiality of the space? Because on the one hand, it gives itself, as Nick Temple said so, in such a relaxed way. It's beautiful. Of course it is. It presents itself as something to be seen. But you also want it to recede. You want there to be latent dimensions. And I wonder if you could elaborate that just a little bit more fully.
Sure. I'm going to just share the screen a bit if I can, if I may. Sorry, just to remind everyone of the plan, I think, because the plan is, in a sense, a part of this relationship. So the point for me, the silence is that, you know, you can let's I think, in order, as I said in this is the most difficult one, as you quite rightly pointed out, that within the argument that I'm making or trying to make. But I think the linear way in which one has this activity that actually would have initially ended up with the table here. So the table would have been a part of that initial vision of the entry, the layers of the entry, prior to the reorientation of moving up through this way, for me is a part of that subtlety. And the way that this wall then begins to move away is also a part of that, the potential towards understanding it in a slightly more complex, in a more complex way. But I'm probably not. Let me just, sorry. But the table, the photograph of the table, is really interesting, because in the plan, this is described, I think, as an office. Oops, it's shifted again. Is described as an office. When in fact, when Corb is presenting it here, he's very much. It's not very shallow. It wouldn't have been as. He's darkened it. He's darkened the back of this in order to make it like a cave at the back of the wall, and the light of the table, you know, the shadow absolutely forms on the corner of this point here. So we get the relationship between the materiality of the table played off against the oversized photographs, which are sort of a bizarre rescaling, and I chose it partly because of the rescaling that Michelangelo was doing in terms of the Laurentian as well. There's a sense of scale which is a part of the architect's toolkit, if you like. So I accept that this might be pushing the point a little bit too far, but it seemed to me to be worthwhile at least trying to set it up as a possible example, because that silence or the latency, it would not necessarily be obvious every time you walk through that door, but it might be obvious at an evening meal where the meal is laid out and there's clearly an idea of a communality within the table, which Corb is trying to talk about. So it's the relationship of the table itself and that table in relationship to the wall and the garden and the cave, for me, which is that sense that when they sat down, if they sat down to eat at that point, that would have been a point at which that maybe that the latency of the relationship to nature might have been more obvious. Does that make sense, David? I don't know.
It's a really helpful comment. My sense of it, I'll just say in passing, is that those students who'd come to Paris, presumably from Switzerland, felt lost. That micro and macroscopic view of the alpine landscape, it poses a similar kind of questions to the Michelangelo uncertainties. And yet, as you say, sitting across the table, looking at it again, the resonances, the implications, the deeper structure of meanings that I think you attach to the concept of latency, they come into visibility, but not necessarily, not every day, not when I'm in a hurry to get my lunch or read a book or meet a friend. So this capacity of the space to give itself to experience at several levels, patent and latent, provides, I think, I wanted to hear you talk about it more, because now I see more clearly the day of the festival, but that was yesterday. Today I'm going back to work. Yeah. And this oscillation between kinds of content, levels of meaning, or if you will, times in and out of time, strike me as maybe just as helpful as the immediate sense of threshold as transition. But it's rather the body and content of the space that makes it resonate or articulate content in different ways at different levels, according to interests that you and I might have individually, but also now and then together, which is to say the tension between individual and community to which you referred, I think, in your closing comments. it was around those issues that I thought it's actually, well, on the face of it, difficult, maybe also a particularly good example of a space that could be usefully described in the terms that are useful when accounting for festive experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw that Dagmar was poised. I hope you still are.
Yes, yes. Well, the conversation has moved on a bit, but just to comment further on that table, I think those marble tables, this one here and the one that Corbusier had at his own home, are remarkable in many ways because they're such a good example of this secular sacred that Peter Carl has often talked about. The tables actually have a groove around the periphery to catch the blood, as it were, which sort of stresses their altar-like quality. And yet, you know, this is a collegiate dining room. It's not a church. And one wonders, well, first of all, it seems that there's this nostalgia to recapture something of a time before society became so secular. And this brings me to a conversation that Christian and I have sometimes had about my skepticism about the possibilities of modern people truly participating in ritual. I think that Corbusier, you know, captured this yearning for monastic life, this yearning for the sacred that somehow eludes many of us these days. I mean, interestingly, the second wall painting after this photographic collage came down, the painting that he painted there is really a summary of the artist's creativity as a power, and it's a kind of celebration of the individual, of the artist. Again, that's quite different from what one might expect in a sacred setting. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think your you know, our conversations about engagement in ritual, I think what in a sense I was trying to say at one point, maybe I skirted over it too quickly, was that that in Turner's notion of incorporation, there is this sort of sense of the theatre of ritual. But unless there is this, for me, unless there is this middle bit, this transition, that if one treats, in a sense, one is in danger of treating incorporation as an extended version of separation rather than understanding it's orientated in a completely different way, which is, I think, your point, that often we just think that we do ritual when in fact we're just extending separation into incorporation without understanding its reorientation towards something divine or other. I don't know how one would describe it, but I think that's why I spent so long trying to get to a point where I could talk about transition, because I think with that, and that's where I think something like the Assamkirche, the Weltenburg, is really useful, because it's a real statement about theatricality, but at the same time probably the most ritualistic setting of all of them. But at the same time, it still allows that tension to be displayed in a way that we couldn't do now. And so I suppose my sense to saying that an architect can't do that these days is a tacit agreement with you that ritual can't be understood, because you have to understand that relationship in order to understand ritual, potentially. Does that sort of make sense in terms of what you're thinking about?
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there others? I sense that we could go on happily a long time, but Jose is keen, so let's continue a little further.
I'm well aware that it's been a long presentation already, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. There's several things that struck me. I very much appreciated listening to, and in the same spirit in which you presented it, of trying to elicit a response from us. Just a few points I'd like to say in the hope that they may perhaps help you as well. When you spoke of mediation, I think the word mediation, which is often used in all sorts of contexts and with all sorts of meanings, is perhaps sometimes not the best. There are other words that probably could help. As you know, within the sacred context, mediation, there's only one mediator. In Christianity, that's Christ. There's no other mediator. And so when we speak of mediation, beyond that context, we mean something else other, which is not necessarily mediation. For instance, architecture, in that sense, wouldn't be it's a medium, of course, but it's not a mediator. It's a sacred image. It's call it what you like, but it's not. It does not take you to God.
Yep.
That would be impossible. Another thing, for instance, would be intercession. You see, so the intercession already implies the role of a person who intercedes for you. But that's to do with the sacred domain and pilgrimage and everything that you were describing. Then the other point, very succinctly, I mean, I'm almost ashamed to have to present it like this so succinctly, but the other thing that struck me very much is what you said about difference not being the best point of departure to the understanding of community, which would have been the phenomenological approach. In fact, a community would be constituted by people. And that what you are saying is, I think, reverberates, that community. If you start from community, you can understand difference far better. And that takes me, of course, to the whole point of personhood you find and communion you find from people like Levinas to John Zizioulas, talking about being in communion, where, again, put it very diagrammatically, there is no being prior to relation. You cannot speak of it. So that might perhaps help you. But then I see, again, very cursively, I think that there is a problem in trying to, and if we were to try and apply that same kind of structure to architecture in the city and say there is no architecture without a city, we would have a problem, because it's really not the same thing. The city is not communion. There is plenty of dissonance, and yes, there is communion, but there's also its opposite, and it plays an immense role in that. We see it. It's quite visible, and the difference is far more affirmed. So those are the things that kind of struck me, and I think that if you try and go beyond the sheer domain of say Christianity and so on, you try and bring people together. One example that comes to my mind, for instance, of this sort of unity, but problematic unity, is the headquarters of the United Nations, where they built a meditation room. Doug Hammarskjöld, who was the man who guided that. And of course, because you had to avoid all sorts of symbols of Christianity or Islam or Judaism, they left a piece of iron ore, which is then struck by a beam of light. So all that, really struck me as you spoke, and I wonder if that course of the question of personhood and communion rather than relationship. Or relationship is a problem because of Kant. But I think, it's cursed by Kant's aesthetics. But maybe the question of personhood and communion might be might help formulate the question you're saying, at least from what I can see. I don't know if that helps, Christian. I'll leave it at that.
Everything helps. Everything helps. But yes, no, I think a part of the issue with something like this is very much the use of language. That when one's trying to argue that we don't start from difference, that we start from something else, then it's important that the language supports that, because it's very easy to use terminology that immediately prejudices the situation. So no, it's really very, very useful, because your own particular insights into this, it's very useful for me. So thank you.
Well, yes, thank you, Christian. I would just sort of end in a way by saying how incredibly poignant it is for us as we struggle with the business of making architecture. I think there's an issue of intensity that is there, because there are certain contexts that all festivals imply intensity of some kind, whether they're taking place in a everyday context of a market or a street. But the sequence for me personally, is one that's given a sense of focus through a building like a law court with which we're dealing, in which the distance, the optical distance between eyes and levels and passageways, and the sort of sense of that question of intensity, and indeed it is theatrical in a way, but the rites and passage thresholds, transitions that have been talked about, are absolutely part of the work of designers and architects, whether it's city making or building making, so to speak. So many thanks, for drawing so much to attention. Much appreciated. A round of applause, I think, in this virtual setting, but wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Cheers.
Yeah.